Running commentary. We are exploring listening to albums. It is a lost art form. David Bowie, Diamond Dogs. David Bowie at this point had declared Ziggy Stardust officially dead. His fans had not declared Ziggy Stardust officially dead, and this is definitely true in the single Rebel Rebel. This was seen as the female equivalent of All the Young Dudes, which David Bowie had written for Mott the Hoople and had been a huge hit in 1973. This was the chicks' version. Heart Tramp, I Love You So. It tackled this sort of androgynous thing of not sure if you're a boy or a girl. Let's make no mistakes, when it came to the singles, Bowie and RCA knew exactly what they were doing. Rebel Rebel really is a very important song on Diamond Dogs. The cover depicts grotesques. There are people which are half human, half dog, and they are grey looking and they're not very nice looking. Actually, they're not very dissimilar to the people I see walking around in this day and age. The only difference is there's no cell phone and no bling and no yabba yabba yabba. The reason that this album was somewhat controversial is that in the gatefold edition of this album, it would show the half-human, half-dog genitalia, which of course was not quite to the public's liking, but we should have known by now that David Bowie really was out of his mind in artistry and not really concerned with what other people thought. David Bowie had wanted to make a musical version of 1984. He had contacted the George Orwell estate to do this, and he had been knocked back without any question. That he was just refused permission to do that. Clearly, he hadn't approached the estate without having some work to show them. And Diamond Dogs, it should be noted, as a result, ends up as home, as at least on one side of the material, which should have been slated for the 1984 musical, and that's really important to note here. The cover of Diamond Dogs, we've talked about the grotesques, and the painting was by a Belgian painter who had, basically painted pictures of Bowie from photographs that he'd been given. So you have David Bowie in color, the grotesques in black and white, looking very kind of addled with whatever substance and just not very nice looking, sort of fat and plump and just generally unpleasant. If you think of 74 as the end of glam rock, it really is the end of glam rock, because at this point, all of Bowie's imitators have kind of caught up with him. They've kind of caught up with the tricks. Do you remember we talked about Aladdin Sane and the whole doo-wop thing? They're all doing it now. Mud, Sweet, Shawadi Wadi, they're all there doing the doo-wop because they've heard Aladdin Sane and they think they're being cool. And I think at this point, Bowie just wants to distance himself from the competitors. He's just, oh my God, I don't think there's anything worse than Bowie feeling like he's been caught up with by the competitors. Actually, prior to listening to this album, it wasn't something that I'd paid much attention to, but I really did enjoy listening to Diamond Dogs again as a title track. It's really important to note from the get-go here that what Aladdin Sane has that Diamond Dogs doesn't is glamour and gloss. He'd also gotten rid of the Spiders from Mars, the original lineup band that had been used on Aladdin Sane, nowhere in sight. Instead, it's been replaced with Tony Visconti, who obviously was a long-time Bowie player. But, Woody Woodmansey and all of those guys from the original lineup are not there on this album, and what that results in is a less tight, more kind of elastic sounding background. There's a lot more of a looseness to Diamond Dogs that doesn't exist on the really glossy, glamorous, stylized sort of Aladdin Sane. I can now see where style comes into the equation on Aladdin Sane, but only by listening to Diamond Dogs though. Future Legend opens the album. Sweet Thing is a longer concept piece. Rock and Roll With Me, I would say, is good for live performance. That's why it's on the album. It's something that's going to work well for live performances. I always struggle with these tracks. When I feel as though the only reason the track is on the album is because it's going to be a good live piece, it's like, well, okay, then do a live album. I don't like hearing that it's going to be a good live piece when it sounds as though that's what it's Therefore, Rebel Rebel, we should also mention that when Bowie passed, both Madonna and Bruce Springsteen did tribute versions of that song when he passed. So this is a significant album because it contains the single Rebel Rebel. We Are the Dead is another track on the album. And apparently we are defecating ecstasy. And why not? And apparently that's where we're headed. Defecating ecstasy is I think this album's right on the money about where people go. You know, this album, the concept is post-apocalyptic. I think we're sort of living post-apocalyptic a little bit in what we consider art and what we consider good and what we consider right and what we consider just and what we consider we're entitled to. And I think Diamond Dogs, think about that title. The two do not go together. Diamond is a precious jewel. Dog is an animal that will eat just about anything. And I think that juxtaposition of those two words is really significant in this sort of trashy pre-punk. So here it is again. Punk. And it's on the landscape. We know it's coming down the pipeline. You know, by the end of 1976, punk is going to be a musical force to be reckoned with. Bowie, in his own opinion, foreshadowed this. He saw it coming. He saw where we were headed. And, you know, I think he gives himself credit for being at the beginnings of punk. I think that's okay to do that. It's certainly here on this album with these sort of just don't give a fuck chord changes and very kind of... there's sort of a rabble to the sound of the guitars here, squalling kind of, you know... just trying to upset you. This album really is just trying to upset you, and it wants to. It doesn't care. It is rock and roll. Rock and roll is genocide. It is killing people, and it's just a great record. 1984 sounds like a track from a musical that it was designed for. The soulish guitars give a sort of taste of what's going to happen with young Americans and things of that nature. The strings are great. We've got songs like Brother. There's songs like Candidate. There's a Sweet Thing reprise. What I'm hearing here, which is also, I never expected to hear this, but on that first track, dare I say it, it feels like a Thriller. It feels like Thriller ripped this album off at the beginning, because you've got these kind of cadavers walking around. There's sort of feeling of death and squeaking, and, you know, it's almost like Thriller. There's some connection here. I'm thinking, I wrote it down. It's like, oh wow, like Thriller beginnings, which is always sort of seen as this original masterpiece, but maybe not. Maybe it wasn't. Sisters of Mercy were all over this album. Sisters of Mercy loved this album. I don't care if they agree or not. They did. Oh, one thing I really love is the toilet flush guitar on We Are the Dead. There's a guitar, and they sort of combine it with the cistern of a toilet. And that's badass. Flushing the toilet with a guitar, that's punk right there. That's brilliant. This album definitely gets props for that. And then there's, you know, the chant of the ever-circling skeletal family. I mean, there's some great drugs happening here. I'd love to have been in the room when these songs were being conceived. There's much more experimentation with the song's endings as well. You know, clearly Life on Mars was, you know, we loved that little isolated telephone at the end. And here on Diamond Dogs, we get plenty of these endings. It's all over the place on the endings. Post-apocalyptic. Don't give a fuck. Don't give a fuck about law and order. Don't give a fuck about what you think. Don't give a fuck about what I'm wearing. You've got to hand it to this album for its identity. To say, okay, goodbye to the band, and to get in a whole new band, and to give yourself a whole new lease of life by releasing the band that has given you this tightness takes bravery, it takes courage, it takes artistic vision. The hard part actually here was determining the mark, because I had to hold it up against Aladdin Sane to give it a fair mark. I had to. I absolutely had to hold this up against Aladdin Sane and say, okay, pros and cons. I was like, do I like it better? Do I like it more? And you know, I really couldn't reach a decision. I really liked the gloss of Aladdin Sane. I liked the confidence. I liked the cocky sort of peacock. It was strutting, you know. Aladdin Sane strutted much more than this does. This kind of more, what's the word here? Aladdin Sane knows that you're watching it. Diamond Dogs doesn't care whether you're watching it or not. And I think for that reason, the mark is identical. 78% as the final mark for Diamond Dogs. The post-apocalyptic album, which will remind you why David Bowie evoked such sadness when he passed. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, recommend it to friends, post comments. Also, if you have an album that you'd like to hear reviewed, we welcome your requests.